Richard has a longer history than our other speakers. It's a nice way of saying that. He did his, and he's also worked in a lot of different places in the world. He did his master's research in the Congo on the Okapi with the Mbuti, and his PhD studies at the University of Cambridge in zoology, where he studied the feeding ecology, evolution, and digestive physiology of large Amazonian mammals. He then went on to the highlands of Borneo to do his postdoc with the orangutan and the Dayak, and then moved himself back to the Amazon, working in a postdoc at the Gelji Museum, which is based in Belém. He was here at the University of Florida, we mentioned that earlier, as a professor in wildlife ecology and Latin American, in the Center for Latin American Studies from 1991 to 2000, and then moved to the Durrell Institute of Conservation and Ecology at the University of Kent for the next 15 years or so. He's currently president of Fund Amazonia and director of the Indigenous Cultures and Historic Folk Museums in Iquitos, Peru. He's a member of 4 International Union for the Conservation of Nature specialist groups, peccary, deer, tapir, and primate. He has more than 100 scientific publications, lots of awards, including the Presidential Award from the Zoological Society, which he won twice, the Chicago Zoological Society, a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Latin American Wildlife Society, and a recognition award from the mayor of Iquitos in 2016. He's received funding from C4, USAID, ECA programs, Wildlife Conservation Society, the Moore Foundation, and among others. And he works in partnership with both NGOs, universities, in Peru, as well as the Peruvian government. And I am going to turn it over there. I think Gallo set you up very nicely. He mentioned climate change right at the end of his talk, and I think you might be walking us down that line with your studies in Peru. Thank you, Richard, for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Can you all hear me first?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you well.
Good. Good, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to take a little bit of a historical approach here, because I think in Loreto, where I work now, which is in that large region of northern Peru, we can see kind of a process that has happened. TCD was an extremely important process, part of that process as that happened. I put a map up here, which you can see in that region of Loreto, and the orange or yellow is indigenous territories, but then you can see 2 reserves there. And I think my mouse moved. Casimir National Reserve and the Tomsioka-Tuaya Community Reserve. Well, what happened? When we first started working as biologists on these large animals, that was back in mid-80s. We didn't have camera traps. We couldn't see these animals very well. And so we contacted the subsistence hunters in this region. This was not a reserve at the time. It was just a Tomsioka-Tuaya region. We wanted to look at their stomach contents to see if they were eating and measure intestinal lengths and all this fun stuff that biologists do. And that was great. And, you know, the hunters are really friendly. And so, yeah, we got along really well. And then they came to us with a problem they were having. Since about the 1950s, 60s, 70s, into the 80s, the Amazon was in a downward spiral. There was unregulated timber extraction. There was hunting for animal pelts until the CITES in 1974. There was unregulated meat extraction, commercial fishing going on. And what was happening is in the area where these communities were living, they were starting to lack the resources. They would go out into the lake. There was commercial fishing boats, just take everything out of it, so they couldn't get any fish. They go in the forest, and timbermen hunted the animals out. And so what they were looking for a solution to this open access problem that was caused after the agrarian reform in Peru in 1969. And what happened then, community reserves were just put on the books in Peru, and goes through a regional decree, working with local people who are most interested in having this community reserve because they wanted to keep these outsiders out. And the regional government, national government, was then had its first decree as a regional community reserve. That was back in 1990. What happened then is that it went through a decade of work with TCD. One thing is to keep the outsiders out, the other is to manage wildlife in a sustainable way in these forests. Loreto is a large region. It's 382,000 square kilometers, about the size of Zimbabwe. And in this very large region, a relatively low population density. You have about 1.2 million people, half of which live in Iquitos. And you have about another 25% live in the towns, Nauta, Requena, Cabayacocha, Pavas. And then only about 25% actually live in the wildlands. It's more of the indigenous communities. So what happened is that all of these studies that were done by DICE students then resulted in a series of guidelines, which Gallo has presented a slightly different set of guidelines to the wildlife management than we use in Peru, but a lot of similarities there. Let me go through those, I think. Oh, let me talk a little bit then about some generalities of hunting. I'm going to come back to this map. I'm sorry about the Spanish. One thing important here was that change that happened in 1974, which is the implementation of CITES. Peru took this on and they implemented CITES, and first, maybe not so perfectly, but right now it's very well implemented. And as you can immediately see, these are the export of peccary pelts out of Peru, which is a legal export. That after the implementation of CITES, everything just went down to the basically the current level that we see it today. In general, what we see is that subsistence hunting is the main thing out there. We have your international trade in, well, we're talking mammals now. So it's not entering turtles and things, fish and things like that. So international trade, very low. Wildlife meat markets in Iquitos, low. I'll come back to that in a moment. And timber hunting, this was probably higher than it is now because the timber companies are really being monitored much more tightly because timber hunting is not legal because timber operations are commercial activity and not a subsistence activity. And therefore, they can't use that to feed employees. And then we have subsistence hunting, which you can see is by far the most important. So that's what we focused on. We realized subsistence hunting is key here to try to manage. Now, we do look at the meat markets in Iquitos. We've been following them since 1986 and continue to follow them. What we saw was that basically after about 2006, 2007, things started going down. And we believe a lot of this has to do with chickens. Chickens are helping to save the Amazon. It was about this period that a chicken industry moved into Iquitos from the Tarapoto region. And, you know, they import their food for the chickens, so they're not cutting down forests there. And, you know, chicken is a socially acceptable and economically acceptable food in Peru. Peru is a chicken country. Chefs know that. And so we feel that that has taken the place of a lot of wild meat. While the population of Iquitos has expanded greatly, actually the sales in the wild meat are going down. And that's going to continue as things become more certified in the future. And I'll get to that just a little bit later. Anyway, our wildlife management model basically has to do with rural people want this. Why do they want this? Why did those people come to us in Tamchiaco-Tuayo? That was food security, food sovereignty. I think the better expression of that is more holistic in that. And that's why they came. So if the local communities are asking for this because of food security, then that's driving the issue. Then you need management plans, yes, and you need to hunt appropriate species and stop hunting inappropriate species, which Gallo explained very well. And then you have to use different models to evaluate the sustainability. And then you need to implement long-term monitoring in community-based systems. Use a catch per unit effort with local hunters. And then the community should conserve the wildlife habitats. this is important because we know the carrying capacity of the animals, or the maximum population of animals, can be dependent on the bushmeat species, at least in terms of food. If you're cutting down all your fruit trees, you're not going to have many animals left. If you improve your habitat, you can actually increase your animals. This wildlife habitat thing was extremely important for us from the very beginning of us being interested in community-based wildlife management, because we saw very clearly if these people are interested in food security, they obviously were, and they want a healthy grocery shop, which means a forest full of animals, they need to maintain healthy, intact Amazonian habitat. So what is community-based wildlife management doing? Yes, it's conserving those species, those being hunted, but in addition to that, this is the mechanism for Amazon conservation, because they're also conserving the 99.9% of the species that they don't hunt. And that was an important part of this strategy. And then we tagged onto that source sink areas, hunted and non-hunted areas, et cetera. So one of these areas that we did this in, we can go back quickly to this map, was this area of Tomshaktuwayo during the 90s was TCD. Let's see what's happened. Oh yeah, we also implemented then a peccary certification program. Because subsistence hunters can legally sell peccary pelts in Peru, if that peccary pelt originated from subsistence hunting, that continues to this day. This was a mechanism for us, because if the communities were implementing those guidelines, and the communities can be green labeled or certified, and then the peccary pelts that are coming from those communities using wildlife sustainably, those that get an added value, and then help process of sustainability. So this is what happened. Sorry about, again, the Spanish. So this is the 1990s. The blue are animals appropriate for hunting. The red are animals which are not appropriate for hunting. As you can see, between the non-managed system in the 1990s, when everything was just being set up and investigated, to the system then in the 2010s, a general decrease in hunting, but then the focus was on those species more appropriate. Unfortunately, the species which are more appropriate are also the ones that bushmeat hunters like the most. And so this all moved in a nice direction. Okay, then what happened? That map before was in the 1990s, and let's look at a more recent map. This is 2016. Well, what you can see in this map is there's a lot more indigenous territories expanding, and then it's these green ones, which are important, Kaismiri and others. What happened in Tomshaktuwayo was that all went in that sustainable management direction, not only with bushmeat, but also with palm fruits, with fish, agriculture production, all moving in that sustainable direction. But Kaismiri was a different issue. In the 1990s, Kaismiri was managed like a park. The local people, indigenous people, were not allowed to go into the area, and they would be restricted. And what happened is their grocery shop was closed for them. What we saw during the 1990s, there was more poachers in Kaismiri than we ever seen before. Hunters and fishermen. The people were trying to get in there. The grocery shop was closed. What would you do? Go in and take as much as you could, as fast as you could, before the whole thing just completely collapsed. And that's what they were doing. And we saw a real decrease in animals during that period from that unmanaged overhunting caused by that conflict. But then people started getting killed, and the Peruvian government couldn't put up with that anymore, obviously. Conflict was too great. So what they did is they changed Kaismiri to management very similar to community-based Tomshaktuwayo. What they call is community-based co-managed system, where they incorporate the management groups from the local indigenous people as part of the dual management with the protected area authority. And that has worked really well, and animal populations come back and rebounded, and there's giant river otters everywhere. It's fantastic. Then what happened in about when the regional governor came in and was up for this, very nice. He redid Tomshaktuwayo as a new category, which had much greater strength because it was much stronger, which was regional conservation area. So Tomshaktuwayo and conservation area. Managed the same way, it was a sustainable use. Pakaismira was a national protected area, co-managed. Then what happened? The national government created the Pukukuro National Reserve with the Quechua and other indigenous groups as a co-managed area. The Matseis National Reserve, not indigenous, this was a national reserve, sorry. The Matseis National Reserve, same thing, co-managed like Pakaismira. So you have all three of those now. And the regional government created the Nanai Regional Community Conservation Area, and then there's a Mahuna, and then there's a Ampiaco, and then indigenous areas have increased, and this latest governor, if I would put the 2018 map up there, the orange would be about double right now, because that's been his main focus over now 4 years, is increased territories, and he's done that. And as we know, those are the areas, those people's grocery shops, they're going to manage those areas well, and we're seeing that. Of course, there's always issues has to be dealt with. So what we've seen here is a complete transition in Loreto, with the majority of areas being community-based on sustainable use, including wildlife and fisheries. What's happening now is you have the Pukukuro National Reserve, where the people there now are selling certified bushmeat to the restaurants in Lima. You have Ampayaco, which is doing the same thing. And you have Township Tuayo doing the peccaries, etc. That's all coming together. This is all changing. Or what really our project right now is green economy, because that's what we're seeing. Indigenous people are doing whatever they can to get rid of this oil. Because, you know, the oil spills here have been tremendous. That's going to go away. We know that. That doesn't have a future. Oil doesn't have a future generally. Solar and other energies are really coming in. And so we're looking at a transition here to an economy, the rural economy, which is basically green. There are a lot of communities out there that want their regional conservation area. That's their grocery shop. That's the future. That's a sustainable use. And we're seeing animal populations like we've never seen before. Almost everything has come back. There's a few issues there. Caimans have issues have to be dealt with in Loreto and things like that, yes. But in general, we've seen a really positive change. And I think a lot of this was TCD philosophy. If that didn't happen in the 90s, I'm sure Loreto wouldn't look like it looks like today. It would have been maybe strict protected areas, trying to keep everybody out, conflict, all that, which you have many other areas. Here you don't have that. And this is TCD. Another thing about Loreto, if you look here at the map of the Carnegie Institute, and this is now going to get a little bit in climate change, you can see there's two major landscapes in Loreto. The dark orange, which is the upland, terra firma, non-flooded forest, and then that bluish, yellowish, greenish area, which you can see there in the Ucumara Basin, which is a flooded forest, and then along the floodplain of the Amazon. These are flooded forests. These are two completely different ecosystems in terms of wildlife management. In the upland forest, you can have sustainable bushmeat management. In the flooded forest, it doesn't work. Populations are too low. But here, what do you have? You have, oops. Here you have fish. So here everything's focused on aquatic. And you can have huge, up in the upland forest, you don't have very many fish because they're little streams. Here you have lakes, rivers, everything. Hydroscape, which is enormously productive in its fish. It's able to go into flooded forest and feed themselves full and then reproduce as much as they like. Anyway, lots of fish. But what we do see here is this goes through a very consistent annual seasonal cycle. It's like your winter and your summer. What we have here is water level, MSNM, and that's in Spanish, but it should be meters above sea level in English. Now what we see is we have the high water season and the low water season. And this is a difference of almost 10 meters a year. So it's a big difference. And this is going to happen every year, like your winters and your summer happen. But what's happening more recently is we've seen intensifications of these cycles. And we've seen multi-annual events. And you can kind of see this in this graph. This is a peak flood pulse of about 40-year period. You can kind of see how that's floating around in these multi-annual cycles. we hit a high period right here, and we had two of the high, we had the historic years of 2012, 2015, extremely high floods, never seen before in the Amazon, especially 2012, which is the highest. 2015 was the longest, and duration is very important. What happened? And then we've also seen a general, and this has been published in many different, a general decrease in the low water season, which means in the low water season it's drying out, in the high water season it's flooding. But we haven't had a drought since 2010, and this year isn't a drought. It's fine. What happened during those intensive floods is in the flooded forest, we had a 95% decrease in terrestrial mammal species, including the deer, the peccaries, the paca, the guti, the giant anteater, armadillos, all of those crashed by 95%, except tapir. Tapir have adaptations to these very flooded conditions. They got around it. Everything else, they drowned, basically, a lot of them. And then there was much more competition on the reduced lands, predation, all of that. The jaguars and other predators, they did okay. The ocelot went down and the guti went down. Jaguars maintained themselves, they changed. Prey, they went from mammals to turtles. And they were fine. And they can climb trees, so they're not really terrestrial anyway. And so they did fine. The puma, it seemed to survive. It was okay. And again, they can get up in the trees. So they're going to do okay. So we saw a massive decrease. What happened was fish. Well, in 2010, you had that drought. In 2010, what we saw was a real decrease in fish, which means droughts are very important in terms of knocking down fish. And so we've seen it. But what happened after that, during these years of intensive floods, which started about 2011, they increased to the maximum that we've never seen before. And there was so many fish out there in 2016, it was incredible. Now they've come down. 2 years of consecutive normal and not so high. And this year it didn't flood at all. This year was a very strange year in terms of high water levels. Didn't go, and so the fish population is way down now. Fish prices are way up because the fish didn't reproduce. They couldn't get in a flooded forest this year. Now it's in high water season. Low water season is all normal. That's okay. What's happening here in the flooded forest, of course, people are basically starting to give up hunting. Well, out there they can't find the animals. There are no animals out there. So they're starting to give up hunting. At first, we thought that was going to impact the primate populations a lot, and that the primates would go down because people wouldn't find a large game. Oh, they're going to hunt primates. It didn't happen like that. People gave up hunting, period. They didn't want to spend any money on the cartridges and guns and food on anything. And so primate populations actually went way up at the maximum that we've seen. So this is something that, you know, we're being impacted here by these climatic intensifications. And so if we look at some of these figures here that I've shown previously in that graph, international wildlife trade in mammals, wild meat market sales, hunting by timbermen, hunting by subsistence hunted. And then we have this 1960s where we have data on the peak mortality by commercial hunting. That was 280,000 animals in 1960. Well, look what happened to us with climate change. We lost 1,500,000, almost 2 million we actually calculate. Some readjustments that went down, but it's the same. It's an orders of magnitude more mortality. And you know, there's a real effort now about international wildlife trade in the Amazon here in Peru because there's funding coming in from somewhere. That's finger pointing. That's saying the people here, they're destroying the wildlife, they're destroying the Amazon, the people here can't do anything, we have to prohibit, we have to prohibit, we have to prohibit. I'll tell you where the finger pointing should be. Look at what climate change did to us. That's the thing I have is this international wildlife trade focus sometimes here in the Amazon where people come in and they just want to close everything down, get rid of subsistence hunting because they might be trading, you know. This is where I feel that you have to be careful. You have to have long enough data sets and see what's really happening out there and look at the different angles of it before you can start finger pointing here. And so Well, I think that's it, yeah. And so, yeah, we're a very positive thing. I think Marianne, okay. If I look at this map here, I can retire in peace. This is good. All right, that's it.
Thank you.